The Books Podcast, presented by Tim Hague.
Welcome to the Books Podcast. I'm Tim Hague. Now, we've been mining a rich seam of books about pop music recently. You might have heard me talking about Ringo Starr, Pink Floyd, Lennon, McCartney. And if you haven't yet, do scroll down and catch up. So, anyway, you might expect us to soft pedal pop for a while, having done so many, and we would have, if it were not for this irresistible page-turner about Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys by Peter Doggett. He writes in the introduction, "The Beach Boys were the most dysfunctional group of musicians ever to succeed in the pop industry," and he is not kidding.
The Beach Boys came together at the very end of 1961, and at the very end of 1964, Brian had his first nervous breakdown. Right the way up until the murders happened, Dennis is still giving interviews, telling the Manson line. He's repeating the whole Manson rhetoric. And at the same time, Charles Manson is going around and describing himself as being the drummer of the Beach Boys. If I had to get somebody to sing me to my grave, it would be, unfortunately, the late Carl Wilson.
I ask you, gentlemen of the jury, is this the kind of book you'd like your wives and servants to read?
Peter, thank you for joining us on Books Podcast.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Well, this book is, frankly, a roller coaster of catastrophes, self-destruction, family feuds, failures and aborted projects. But before we go into all that, we need to start with who they were, because while I think almost everybody knows that Brian Wilson was a Beach Boy, we just should spend a minute
Absolutely, yep, we should.
identifying the basis of the band and who they were and where they came from.
Okay, well, they came from Hawthorne, California, which is a suburb of LA, inland a bit from the beach, and not one of the richer suburbs of LA. So, and there was always a slight class consciousness, the difference in financial terms between the three Wilson brothers and their first cousin, Mike Love, who for most of his childhood was definitely a social class up from the Wilson brothers. He was also, Mike Love, the oldest member of the Beach Boys. So he had sort of two advantages, really, in terms of, bragging rights over the group. So was Mike Love. He's the lead singer. Three Wilson brothers, and so they're Mike Love's first cousin. The oldest of them is Brian. He's the musical genius and also a severely troubled, really sensitive guy. His next brother down was Dennis, who had all sorts of issues. I think these days he would be diagnosed with ADHD or whatever. Found it really difficult to concentrate, but he ended up becoming a remarkable composer as well. And the youngest brother, Carl, who had grown up watching his two older brothers being beaten up by their dad. So,
okay, we need to talk about Murray Wilson.
We need to talk about Murray Wilson.
It's impossible to understand the dynamic of the Beach Boys
Absolutely,
without
yeah.
seeing where he fits in. And 'cause he was a sort of frustrated songwriter, or is frustrated the word?
Semi-successful. I mean, he was successful to the extent that some well-known bands and singers did record some of his songs in the 40s and 50s, but he thought he was up there with Gershwin and Cole Porter, and he wasn't. And he was always 5 steps behind in terms of what was happening in the music business. He had been really badly bullied by his father. So, of course, in keeping with fathers of that era, the middle of the 20th century, he decided to repeat the dose on his own
American
children.
music's littered with that sort
I know,
of thing, isn't
yeah,
it? You've
well.
got, Michael Jackson's father
Yep.
and recently Britney Spears' dad.
Oh, goodness, yes, I know.
It really does seem to be a pattern, doesn't it?
So he recognised very early on that his elder son, Brian, was something of a genius. He could put together harmony arrangements. He could come up with tunes. He could do things that kids of his age, we're talking about pre-teen, should not be able to do. And he just did it naturally without musical training. And so he then took Brian under his wing and wanted to mould Brian into a sort of mini Murray, except more successful. Now, Brian, meanwhile, wanted to do vocal harmonies with his brothers and his cousin, which is what they did. So Brian would write songs, Brian would adapt other people's songs, and come up with these really square harmony arrangements, but they were still beautiful. There was a real trend in the 1940s and 50s in America of really straight-laced white singing groups who could come up with incredible harmony arrangements, but they weren't going to frighten the horses or the mums and dads. They would be nice, polite variety TV show fodder. And that, when they started out, that was Brian Wilson's aim. Meanwhile, his two younger brothers and his older cousin are mad about rock and roll and R&B. And so they start bringing in, saying, well, why don't we do Drifters songs and Coasters songs and Elvis songs? And so gradually the sort of musical palette expands. And then famously, Dennis Wilson, the middle brother, was the good-looking one, he was the sporty one, and he loved surfing. And he was coming back from the beach every day saying, we should write a song about surfing. And the rest go, oh, yeah. But eventually he bangs it into their heads long enough. And that's how they start writing surfing songs.
It's a sort of insubstantial platform, though, for a decades-long career. It was a fad. Surfing songs were a fad.
Yeah.
The Beach Boys, which is not a great name for a band, and there had been lots of bands already called Beach Boys, or the Fabulous Beach Boys, or the Latin Beach Boys. So it's not even an original name. And then the Beach Boys are somehow saddled with this, which I think followed them for the rest of their career, that they were supposed to be a surf band.
Yeah. So even later on in the 60s, when they're doing really experimental work and very progressive in musical sense work, like the Pet Sounds album and the incredible Lost Smile album, their record company is still asking them when the next surfing single was coming up, because they know they can sell surfing singles, or at least they could earlier in the decade.
Oh, to go forward many, many decades, one of the amusing things in the book is you relate Dennis Wilson, I think it's Dennis Wilson, as announcing that they were going to do a children's Smurf album with songs like Smurfing USA and Smurfer Girl, rewrite their early hits.
I can hear the spirit of Dennis Wilson carping at that. It was his cousin Mike Love.
It was Mike. Oh, I'm so sorry. But it is a chaotic story and quite difficult to keep straight. So it was Mike. We'll talk about Mike Love in a minute. But other bands all have their story, and in many ways, the Beach Boys is the story of Brian Wilson. So we need to talk a little bit more about him, because he was. You mentioned he was deeply troubled. Presumably not to begin with, but he very quickly succumbed to the pressure. And one of the many repeated motifs in the book is that you've got another singer coming in to deputise for Brian.
Right. Yeah.
There were so many Beach Boys in the end.
Yeah.
And they were always having to find somebody to sing Brian's parts, because he was either not able to or didn't want to join them on the road.
Yeah. No, that's true. I mean, just to give you a timeline, the Beach Boys really came together at the very end of 1961. And at the very end of 1964, by which time they'd had, 8 or 9 really big American hit singles, Brian had his first nervous breakdown on the road, or on the plane, in fact, to be exact. And from then on, mental health, as we would say now, was a huge preoccupation for him. But obviously in 1964-65, it was something embarrassing and something that he should just get over. And
just pull himself together, yeah.
Pull his surfing socks up and just get on with it. And so it took a long time for Brian to get anything like proper psychiatric help. And when he did get proper psychiatric help, it turned out to be more harmful than having nothing.
Are we talking about Dr. Landy?
We're talking about Dr. Eugene Landy.
That's not my definition of proper psychiatric help.
But he was qualified, Tim. He had all the certificates on his wall.
He was a huckster.
He was a huckster. I met him once.
Did you?
He was a very charming huckster, yeah. But he was treating Brian very much as
everybody
a child.
wanted a piece of Brian Wilson. And Dr. Landy, who, yes, was trying to treat him, is getting himself credited as a songwriter, a co-writer on songs, and a producer on albums, where he had no qualifications. He was a therapist of sorts. But
he was the kind of therapist, and there is a respectable school of sort of psychoanalysis or whatever that does this, that becomes in effect a surrogate parent. And so you enter yourself into the client's life 100%, 24 hours a day, you're there. Now, in Brian Wilson's case, he couldn't go to the loo without getting permission from Dr. Landy.
There were two spells. There were a couple of years in the 70s, and then he
Yep.
came back, and like a decade he was
Yes,
looking
in the
after
80s to
Brian.
90s,
And
yeah.
clearly Brian needed somebody to look after him. But he never seems to have found the right person to do it. Everybody seemed to just want a piece of him.
Yes, and even down to, I mean, lots of people have accused his second wife, whose name was Melinda, who died a couple of years ago, sadly. Some people have even said that she was basically manipulating him. I like to give her the benefit of the doubt and say that I think she did really care for Brian. But at the same time, when you've got this cash cow and you're married to him, and you can see ways in which he and you can make vast amounts of money, it's very difficult not to encourage him. So, well, just do one more tour, Brian. Just do one more album. Whereas I think in later years, Brian would have been much happier just staying at home and watching TV.
And singing fun, fun, fun. as the Bare Naked Ladies had it. We need to whip through this because there are an awful lot of people to talk about. You've got a chapter that starts off, why do people hate Mike Love? Let me count the ways, says Peter Doggett.
What an original line.
But he's kind of a character, is Mike Love.
And
he's still at it.
He's still at it. Yes, I think I filled a page and a half of the book with all the reasons. And I completely damn him to hell. And then I say, that's the case for the prosecution. And then I do what almost nobody does and say, look at it from his point of view. He's the person who was the leader of the band on the road. Certainly, he's the front man. He's the one who's selling the songs to the audience. So he's got that unique connection.
And he's been the only person who was a member of every Beach Boys lineup.
Yeah,
there were
he's still
thousands
there.
of different Beach Boys
Yeah,
lineups.
exactly. He's still there. So he knows what goes over in a live context and what doesn't. And so when Brian is writing increasingly abstruse and bizarre songs from the late 60s onwards, Mike is the one who's saying, okay, that's great, Brian, and I'm happy to come and sing on it, but how is that going to fit in alongside Good Vibrations and I Get Around and Help Me Rhonda? You know, it's not going to work. And so Mike has always been, I think, unfairly maligned for wanting to keep the Beach Boys going and for keeping it going as a commercial unit rather than just an art unit that wouldn't sell any records.
But this is the point, isn't it? The Beach Boys, there were as many different competing visions of the Beach Boys as there were Beach Boys.
Yeah.
And that's if you don't build in also record companies and would-be managers and therapists.
Yeah, I mean, my view of the Beach Boys, I was 13 in 1970 when I really started getting into music. And so the Beach Boys, I bought a Greatest Hits album very early on, so I got to know all the classic 60s songs. But at the same time, I bought the Surf's Up album, which is art rock, basically. Not entirely, but at least half the album is very challenging, experimental, interesting ways of using the Beach Boys ingredients to reach new artistic ground. And then they carried that on for two more albums, Carl and the Passions and Holland. And so that was my Beach Boys. That's what I grew up with. And after 1973, they didn't do that anymore. They suddenly went back and, we're a 60s revival band, and they've been that ever since, except that their creative genius has popped up every now and then with bizarre songs about food or exercise or whatever was his fixation that week.
Well, you said that Brian was you describe him as the greatest pop arranger of his generation. He could do the harmonies. He had a wonderful ear for melody, and so yes, he was this creative genius. Well, something that troubles me about it is that he obviously gets the credit for the songs. He didn't write lyrics.
He sometimes wrote lyrics, and occasionally, like the song "Till I Die" on Surf's Up, which I recommend to you if you don't know it, he could write really simple and absolutely emotionally devastating lyrics. But given left to his own free devices, he would often write really banal lyrics. And so, yeah, all the way through the Beach Boys story, starting with Mike Love, he has needed strong lyricists.
And there are, I don't know, I sort of stopped making notes after about 8 or 9 of them.
Yeah.
There were lots and lots of different lyricists.
Lots of
But
them.
So we regard Brian's greatest works as wrenched from his soul. They're expressions of his concerns, but he's not writing the words. Is he? I mean, how does it work? Is he saying, I'd like to write a song about being lonely, and then
Yeah.
Van Dyke Parks or
Yes,
Tony Asher or somebody says, oh, I can do that for you, mate.
Yeah, or often he would have a phrase, a title phrase or something, or a feeling. It would be a feeling, and certainly you mentioned Tony Asher. He wrote most of the lyrics for the Pet Sounds album. And he told me how they would sit down and Brian would say, well, I'd like to write a song about how I feel thinking about this girl that I always fancied at school, but I was too shy to go and talk to her. And then when I did talk to her, she gave me the heave-ho. And Tony would go away and put that feeling into lyrics. And then they'd go backwards and forwards. And Brian would adjust stuff and say, no, that's not quite what I meant, and so on. Now, there's nothing unrespectable about that. I mean, the American songwriting tradition, if you go back through the 20th century, you look at, I think someone like Cole Porter, who wrote words and lyrics, is very much the exception. So all the great American standards
There's
were,
nothing
were written by
disreputable.
teams. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Elton John has.
Yeah, and Bernie Taupin.
Bernie Taupin writing words for him.
But there is that thing. I remember as a teenager thinking, because I like James Taylor, I like Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, Joni Mitchell, Paul Simon, and yeah, I get that feeling of, well, they're expressing themselves. Elton John singing somebody else's words. So to me, I can understand that sort of slight feeling.
I think part of it sort of boils down to, and it's a sort of big picture thing about this, about the Beach Boys and about the book. It seems to me that nobody ever properly curated the Beach Boys' career or legacy. There were always, I said, these competing visions of what the band should be. And there are bizarre albums, and maybe 3 would be released within 2 months. And then they'd drag stuff out of the vaults and put it on a new record, or lots of rewriting old records or re-recording early songs, doing pointless cover versions of things. Nobody seems to have been in a position to sit down and say, no, this is not right, because this is going to dilute our legacy. Is that a fair comment?
I think that's fair, going back as far to the mid-'60s, and certainly Mike Love, if he was here, would agree with you. I mean, his vision of the Beach Boys would be different from mine. I think the answer is that, as you said, the vision kept changing, the personnel kept changing, the power balance in the group kept changing all the time. But the heart of the problem is that there are 2 main competing visions, which is the Beach Boys are a highly commercial, really popular party band, number 1. Number 2, the Beach Boys are an art project. And lots of the hardcore fans, and I put myself in that category, like the art project. I mean, I also love the commercial stuff as well. But the art project gets great reviews and doesn't sell. Whereas the commercial stuff sells, and still sells out arenas and stadiums and whatever.
It will be a surprise to people to learn that Pet Sounds was not really a hit album. You tell us in the book that I think it hit number 10.
Something
in
like that in America, yeah.
Number 2 in Britain, because the UK always liked the Beach Boys. But the Pet Sounds, which if anybody knows the Beach Boys, they'll know that, is a perfect sort of illustration of this. Essentially, it's Brian sitting in the studio at home, making the record while the rest of the Beach Boys are on the road, and then he drags them in for the vocals. But they have very little to do with the conception of the album. In fact, is it right to say that it was considered as a solo Brian Wilson album at some point?
I think in my fantasy of the Beach Boys, it would have been a solo Brian Wilson album. And in fact, the first single from the album was Caroline No, which came out under Brian's name. and wasn't a hit. So
Who sang that?
that was Brian.
That's fine. Because another interesting thing about the Beach Boys is they're weirdly not unprecious about who gets the lead vocal. Most bands are desperately jealous about who gets the spotlight. You've got famously Barbara Ann. The lead vocal is by Dean Torrance of Jan and Dean.
Yeah.
Was he a Beach Boy? What was he
No,
doing there?
he was just their mate. Brian had written some songs for them, and he was he
But
was
it's
invited
so odd
down.
not to care about, or well, no, presumably they cared, but it's so odd not to be jealous of the spotlight.
Yes, I mean the Beach Boys were fantastically good in the studio at sharing the limelight and going, okay, well this song would actually suit Dennis. And he may annoy us the rest of the time and be a liability on stage because he's drunk and he keeps trying to beat Mike Love up in the middle of songs. But for this song, he is the perfect person to sing it. And they were so good at arranging the voices, so it didn't matter which one of them was in the lead. The others would sort of automatically slip into this perfect harmonic blend behind them.
And you wind up then with, well, yes, other singers and many different Beach Boys coming in and singing on albums. You also wind up, of course, because the Beach Boys are on the road for, well, we're still talking about Pet Sounds here. It's the master musicians in Los Angeles who are playing on it. Brian brings in musicians who he knows will be wonderful, and it doesn't. He doesn't even. Brian was a bassist. How good a bassist was he? Was he any good?
He was pretty good. He was better on piano, I think, but he was never a musical genius in terms of somebody who could do a recital.
Dennis was the drummer.
Dennis was, and Dennis only learned drums because their mum said, "Well, he's got to be in the band, so he can play drums then." So the really talented musical Beach Boy was Carl Wilson, who played lead guitar. And even at 13 or 14, he was a really excellent rock and roll guitarist.
And you tell us that he had the most beautiful voice of the
not just
Wilson.
of the Wilsons or the Beach Boys, but of anybody. I mean, I'd almost, if I had to get somebody to sing me to my grave, it would be, unfortunately, the late Carl Wilson.
Of course, he died of lung cancer, which, having smoked, the sheer pressure of being the peacemaker.
Yeah.
He smoked heavily all his life.
Yeah.
Dennis, on the other hand, came to his death was a misadventure.
A misadventure at the end of decades of self-destruction. When he was about 20, Dennis told a reporter, "I can't drink. If I drink, it will kill me. I know that." He had some sort of stomach issue and he'd been told he mustn't drink. So, of course, he becomes an alcoholic. And he basically drinks himself to death, besides doing all the usual rock and roll drugs as well. But it's the drink that gets him. He becomes increasingly out of control on stage, increasingly non-productive in a group sense, and that the others are so cross at having to spend any time with him that the fights break out immediately. And he ends up 79 to 80, he gets banned from being on stage with the group. And he only comes back in 1980 to play in England, actually, at Wembley Arena, because it was in the contract that all the Beach Boys had to be there. So that was the only reason. And then the last couple of years of his life, he was occasionally on stage with them, but he couldn't sing. He'd lost his voice because he'd had a fight with somebody 10 years earlier. So his voice was like that. And then the drugs and the drink on top of that.
That must have interfered a little bit with the beauty of the harmonies.
Well, yes, I think they would keep him off mic as much as possible, yeah.
But in both senses.
Yes, it were very good, yeah. But at the same time, he's almost the soul of the Beach Boys. So there are two really poignant moments in the Beach Boys story. When Dennis dies at the end of 83, he drowns. He keeps jumping into a cold Southern California harbor and just after Christmas. I'll do one more dive, and he's very drunk. Eventually it's one too many and he doesn't come back up again. And then how many years later, 15 years later, his brother Carl dies. Now, when Dennis dies, the spirit of the Beach Boys goes. Even if he wasn't the main contributor, he represented the soul of the Beach Boys. He felt for the Beach Boys, even if he couldn't always contribute. It was the most important thing in his life. 15 years later, his brother Carl dies. He's the voice of the Beach Boys. So without those two, when there's still a Beach Boys on the road, I did go and see him a couple of months ago, and it was very professional, but it had no soul.
Well, it's professional now. The book often relates terrible tours that fall apart, or concerts that are a disaster, and there was a long spell when they were being the Beach Boys, but not delivering for the punters, wasn't there? And this is really what I wanted to ask you. When they did manage to get behind the microphones, was the magic still there, no matter how appalling the circumstances
You could
were?
usually rely on Mike Love to entertain until, unless he got so fed up with the others that he basically gave up. The other guy we haven't mentioned, we've got this far in, and we haven't mentioned Alan Jardine, who was an original member, left for about a year really early on to train in dentistry, and was then called back by Brian, and was there for the next 30 years. And he was the one absolutely dependable member all the way through. And then the other person who replaced Brian on the road in 65, left for a while in the 70s, and then came back for one album and is still there 46 years later, was Bruce Johnston.
And who's he? Where does he
Now, he's an LA, not somebody who creates a scene or a trend, but he rides every scene in the 60s. He's an extremely good pianist, a perfectly good at harmony and occasionally lead vocalist, very good at writing pastiche songs, and Mr. Reliability. And so he is the other Beach Boy who is still on the road with Mike Love.
We've talked about songwriting, and you always still need a new album. Who was then generating the material for them?
Well, in the early 70s, which, as I said earlier, was the period when I fell in love with them, every member of the band, and they also had two young South African guys in the band for 2 or 3 years as well, and they were writing songs. So at one point you had, just doing the maths here, 7, 8, I've lost track, 8 Beach Boys all writing quality adult material at the same time. And then you have the bizarre thing where the person who's been least featured really musically, apart from as a drummer on the Beach Boys records, is Dennis. And suddenly he reinvents himself as the ultimate romantic balladeer.
Nobody could have seen that one, could
No, I mean, so he's learned to play piano, and he is able to conjure up, a bit like his brother, these sort of irresistibly gorgeous, achingly slow melodies. He didn't tend to write lyrics either. He would always get his friends or his girlfriend to write the lyrics. But he found a real niche. And his one solo album that came out in his lifetime, which is called Pacific Ocean Blue, since his death in 83, it's become a real cult favorite. And I think there are many younger Beach Boys, including, in fact, the publisher of this book, who rates Dennis Wilson's songs above Brian's.
Wow.
Now, I wouldn't go that far, but he had a very individual talent. But again, at the opposite extreme of the commercial sound that Mike Love was trying to sell on stage.
We circled back to Dennis. We have to mention Charles Manson. Dennis fell in with Manson and the Manson family, who people will remember was a homicidal little cult in California in the late 60s. Again, I mean, it's if you were making this into a film or a novel, you'd think you were overdoing it.
This is the bit where you jump the shark, as they say. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Because you've got this uber squeaky clean group who are still in the late 60s dressing as if it's 1963 or 64, and somehow they stumble across and into the most notorious cult of the late 60s, who end up killing several people, the Sharon Tate murders, etc. I can't remember how many people died altogether, 4 or 5, something like that.
4 or 5. There's La Bianca as well. There was
Yes, that's right.
another
The
house
other-
full
the
of
other
people
house.
that they killed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Dennis had, as he would have, in his sports car, he had picked up a couple of the Manson family girls, given them a lift home, probably via his bed. And they said, "Oh, you must meet our guru, Charlie." And out popped this ex-con who was tiny but had a very magnetic personality. I mean, everybody who met him, who I've ever spoken to, has said, well, he had these compelling eyes. And he was able to gather together a group of naive young people, mostly
women,
mostly
yes.
young women with no clothes on.
Yes.
And they pretty much did whatever he
And that would
wanted.
appeal to Dennis, although
Yeah.
nobody suggested any blame attached to
No,
Dennis.
not
he,
at all.
He was not in any way complicit or culpable.
No, but he was, one of the things I discovered for this book was how much more involved with the Manson family he was than he claimed he'd been. After the murders, the story was very much, well, I did run across them, and yes, I did let Charlie play me some songs, and okay, we did give him one demo session, but we didn't like him and we were scared of him, and I hadn't seen him for 18 months before the murders. That's the official story. And then I discovered that right the way up until the murders happened, Dennis is still giving interviews discussing how he's living on a commune with all these girls, and he sends them out to go and raid garbage trucks outside supermarkets to get food. And he's towing the Manson line. He's repeating the whole Manson rhetoric. And at the same time, Charles Manson is going around and describing himself as being the drummer of the Beach Boys.
Yes.
So as
When he gets arrested.
yeah, and other male members of the entourage are always giving Dennis's address as their address, even after the killings, if they get arrested for something. So it's a very weird.
Dennis was a
relationship.
little bit flaky as well. He got heavily into Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and
Well,
transcendental
yeah.
meditation.
Well, the whole
as
group
well.
did. Yes, yeah.
In fact, they even went to was it to Chicago or something to record an album.
Well, they did a tour. Well, but before that, Mike Love went with the Beatles to Rishikesh.
That's
to,
right. Yeah.
To the Maharishi's ashram there, and then he came back with this brilliant plan that the Beach Boys and the Maharishi were going to go on tour, and they did. They arranged about 50 dates across a month in America, and after 4, it was so obvious that it was a disaster that the whole tour was cancelled. The Maharishi became mysteriously ill, as show business people do when they want to cancel gigs because the tickets aren't selling. Because the Beach Boys would come out for half an hour and do surfing songs. Then the Maharishi would stand up in a big auditorium with no microphone and start blessing the crowd and talking to them about meditation. And the people who in the crowd who hadn't left before he started, which was most of them, were throwing things at him and booing and heckling and so on.
Here's the thing, though. The Beatles saw through the Maharishi very, very quickly, really. I mean, they were buying it for a couple of months, but they were not drawn in. But the Beach Boys piled in so heavily.
Well, they did. I mean, in some ways, the Beach Boys made a more public affiliation with the Maharishi by doing this tour, and then Mike Love carried on writing Maharishi-inspired songs. I'm sure he still is. But the Beatles, despite John Lennon being very sceptical at the end of their time in India, George kept up meditation secretly. Ringo kept up meditation. And Paul has come out in recent years and said, yeah, I still do meditation as well. So 3 of the 4 Beatles, right up to the end in George's case, and to this day in the case of Paul and Ringo, they're not followers of the Maharishi, but they still follow the meditation.
They still find
techniques.
something of value,
Yeah,
really.
yeah.
Okay, fair enough. We have to find time to talk about Smile.
Yeah.
Smile is the great lost rock album of all time. It's the legend. And I'm going to, rather than me tell you, I'm going to ask you to tell me about Smile. What was it? When does it happen or not happen, and why not?
Okay, starts happening in 1966. Brian has done Pet Sounds,
And Good Vibrations.
Well, Good Vibrations then becomes part of Smile. Yeah, that's the sort of the joining, the link between the two things. And Brian has met this fantastically intelligent, articulate, brilliant songwriter, lyricist, producer called Van Dyke Parks. And together, they start exploring different ways of looking at the American experience and American mythology. Brian has got into writing very fragmentary songs. You can hear that if you listen to Good Vibrations.
Yeah, it's
a
in
collection
bits,
of bits, which works brilliantly in that case. But with Smile, he never quite got his head round what the structure was. He had all these inspired bits.
Was it psychological breakdown and narcotics? Was that interfering with his ability to do it by this point?
I think he probably at that point would have said narcotics and acid and so on were actually helping, were inspiring him. And he certainly felt opposition from the record company who were going, is this about surfing? I'm not sure. And also the rest of the band, because again, Mike Love and the rest of the people on the road were coming back and going, well, this is a brilliant 20-second fragment. I don't understand what it's about. I've no idea. It's very pretty. What do we do with that? Where do we put that in the show? I mean, they contributed to the album, and if Brian had finished it in 1967, I'm sure they would have tried to sell it on the road.
How close was it to completion? Because it didn't come out then.
It didn't, no.
40 years later we have. But
well, it was close enough.
I'll ask you about that too.
It was close enough for the Beach Boys, as you say, 40 years later, to put out a box set of five CDs.
Oh, also, their record company had printed half a dozen copies of the sleeve.
Half a million copies.
Half a million, as you say, yes. Half a dozen wouldn't be so many. No. Just about cover the basic Beach Boys.
Yeah, and there was a booklet to go with it and so on, which was all ready. But I don't think Brian ever had confidence that he knew what he was doing. He knew what he was doing in the moment. He knew what he was doing within each fragment. But I think he found the responsibility of trying to weave all these fragments together. It's like doing a tapestry, I suppose, and you've got all the bits and which goes in which place on the tapestry.
He needed a producer, but of course he was occupying the producer's chair.
Self-produced.
And at that point, when you lose your sort of vision, you need somebody to come in and say, this is how it can work overall.
And he was starting to suffer regular nervous breakdowns at that point as well. So a combination of things of not feeling fully supported by the outside world, not fully understanding what he was doing, and having really fragile mental health, and probably being off his face most of the time as well. The combination of all those things meant he, from Smile being a great vision of the future, it became like the albatross in the ancient mariner. It was hung around his neck. And he couldn't finish it, and he didn't want to hear about it, and he didn't want to hear the tapes, and don't mention it, and we're never going to release it. Oh, and by the way, I've burned the tapes, which he hadn't, but he came to believe that he had done.
So 40 years later, it is. And I have to admit, I've never heard Smile. You have. How is it?
It's fascinating. It's still not finished, and even when Brian did his own version in the early part of this century, he tried to reconstitute it with Van Dyke Parks again, and his solo band recorded it, and there was an album and a wonderful tour, and then they put the Beach Boys archive stuff out as well. I still don't think it 100% works as an album, but the other thing is that most of the key songs from the record did sneak out. The rest of the Beach Boys
cannibalized it.
Yeah, they knew how good the finished songs were.
Well, for one thing, the Columbia, where their label at one point had a contract that said half of every Beach Boys album had to be written by Brian.
Yeah.
Even when he was in a mental hospital, they had that problem. So presumably they were plundering Smile just to get the percentages up.
Yes, and also because they knew how good the songs were. I mean, my book is called Surf's Up, and that is one of the Smile songs, but it didn't come out until 4 years afterwards. And there were several other ones, Cabernescence and half of the Smiley Smiley album, the Smiley Smile album, which is not the same as Smile. It's a very complicated story. But eventually, almost all the songs, the best bits, had come out. And so what we got in the 21st century was all the linking bits that we hadn't. had in the shops before.
Doesn't that create a problem for the band, though? Because if you're not selling records, where does the money come from? Because, these people have continued to have a sort of jet set pop star lifestyle in decades in which there were years at a time where they didn't have a hit record, or, the tours were underattended. Where did the money come from?
Well, from the mid-70s onwards particularly, around, I'm going to get the year wrong here, 74 or 75, I should know as I've written a book about it. There was an American compilation album, Endless Summer, and it was all the old early 60s hits. And it was an American number one. And so that was a bit of a wake-up call. And so increasingly they became an oldies band. And they always have been and are still a fantastically successful oldies band. It's a very commercial brand. I mean, every time you turn the television on, there's somebody doing a new version of what was it? There was something we were watching on television last night, and suddenly there was a new commercial. Wouldn't it be nice? Was there
2 commercials? I was watching TV as well. Would it be nice? And I think God Only Knows was
right. Okay.
In the same hour, the two adverts were
Yeah.
using. So, and I suppose that's lucrative. Yeah.
It's lucrative, and it keeps the songs in people's in people's ears. So each new generation comes up hearing the songs around. Every couple of years, there's a new greatest hits album, which is almost all 1960s stuff. Every time it goes gold or
Because there haven't had very many hits since then.
No, there haven't been that many since then. No.
I think the last one was a big hit was Kokomo, wasn't it?
Yeah, which was number one in America.
Who
in the
wrote
late
that?
80s. Almost everybody in California, apart from Brian Wilson.
Brian Wilson.
Yeah. So.
Well, you know what the final question's got to be? Whenever people compile charts or lists of the best albums of all time, Pet Sounds is invariably in the top. Well, it's invariably in the top 2, isn't it? I can't see. I know Pet Sounds quite well, and I can think of half a dozen albums I think are better albums than Pet Sounds. I want you to contradict me. I want you to tell me where you put it.
Well, art is not a competitive field.
Oh, good point.
The pop chart's a competitive field. Art isn't. And so I can have 6 favourite Beach Boys albums, and Pet Sounds is one of them. But I equally love Sunflower, Surf's Up, Holland, even their 1979 LA Light album, which has got an 11-minute disco song on it. I love that one album as well. So for me, it's all part of the joy. So I think it's irrelevant whether it's the best album
What you
of all
mean is
time
you don't
or-
care.
No, I just love them.
And some people do think it's the best album ever
Yeah,
made. So, and that's fair enough if they do.
But you can have the same argument about Sgt. Pepper. Is it? No, it's not the best Beatles album. It's not in my top 5.
No, I think
favourite
it's the greatest album of
Beatles
all time, but it's not the best Beatles album,
Yeah.
which is a Beatles paradox.
Yeah, well, so maybe that's the same with Pet Sounds then. Yeah.
Well, I cannot recommend this book too highly. I am genuinely grateful for it, Peter. I needed this book because it's been a wonderful read. It is Surf's Up, Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys by Peter Doggett. It's published by New Modern at £25. Peter, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next time we'll be discussing Quantum 2.0, the past, present and future of quantum physics by Paul Davies. That sounds like fun.
That was the Books Podcast, presented by Tim Haig. Email Tim on tim@bookspodcast.com, Twitter @bookspodcast, and Facebook @bookspodcasttim.